Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IAPP web conference, Consumer Perspectives on AI and Implications for Your Privacy Program, sponsored today by Ketch. My name is Selena, Programming and Speaker Coordinator here at the IAPP, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started shortly, but before we do, a few quick details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide all IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 CPE credit. A recording of this program and a copy of the slides will be available in your account under My Purchases and My Recordings tab within 48 hours. Feel free to post any questions that you have for our panelists at the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. We are greatly looking forward to today's conversation, and I will now hand it over to Jonathan to begin the program.
Thanks, Selena. So here we're going to talk about consumer perspectives on AI. We just completed a study on how they feel about it, but also we've got Alysa Hutnik here, who longtime lawyer, privacy and security practice at Kelley Drye, and Vivek. I'll let them both introduce themselves. Vivek's 20+ year co-founder, technologist, and one of the things we want to do today is talk about AI, but talk about it in the context of privacy and hear from the technologists and hear from the lawyers. We like to say privacy is a team sport, and so the whole idea here is that we're getting those two stakeholders together. But Alysa, to you first, a little about yourself. People call you the queen of privacy. Is that right? Is that
it's quite the tip. I think I'm old and I'm going to hold up the royalty side of this. Thank you. I'm Alysa Hutnik, and I would say kind of my perspective coming in here for all my 20+ years, I started as consumer protection, which I think is such a table setting for so many of the questions we're really thinking about now with generative AI. Half my docket is working with companies who are investigated by state attorneys general or the Federal Trade Commission. And the other half, the fun part, is helping companies really try to figure this out. And I think in this space, just like so many other consumer protection privacy issues, it is not black letter. It's not super clear. It's a whole lot of judgment, and it's a whole lot of looking around the corner and having imagination. And I love having all of these different stakeholder perspectives at the table to try to figure this out, because I think particularly things moving so fast, that's the way to do it.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vivek Vaidya. I'm one of the founders and CTO of Ketch. As Jonathan said, I've been I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been building software, data management software in particular, for the last 25 years or so, and it's been fascinating to see how the space has evolved, how much attention now is being paid to data governance, privacy, compliance, etc., as privacy by design, as part of the software development lifecycle. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation with Alysa and Jonathan to talk about generative AI and everything else that's related to that vis-a-vis privacy.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks, Alysa. And I'm JJ. I head up solutions at Ketch. I don't usually wear ties, but that was the best photo I could find from my brother's wedding 10 years ago. But here we go. So what are we talking about today? So we're gonna dig into the study. And I'm going to ask Vivek and Alysa on their perspectives on what they think about all the different pieces to that. What made the study unique is we didn't just ask people what they thought about AI and where the benefit, where the harm was, but also would they spend more with companies who did AI right? And did AI right for us means, did they approach it ethically? Did they have responsible data practices around it? How are they using it? And so we've got some interesting numbers later on. How much more would they buy from brands who do this right, and how much more would they trust them? We're going to dig in on Gen AI and kind of what it means from a technologist perspective, but also where privacy tech is innovating to kind of rise up to meet the challenge. And of course, balancing that with some of the legal considerations we need to think about as we enter this world. And of course, where do we go from here? Especially as technology changes, as AI evolves, and what are some of the things we can do today to start to prepare as privacy and AI really start to, we think, come together in a big way. So a little on Ketch. We're privacy management technology. We have the kind of soup to nuts technology platform for privacy, everywhere from data discovery to risk assessments to consent management. Our thing, what makes us unique, is we think about privacy as a data challenge. So how do you control data from beginning to end, from collection to retention? And how do you do that transparently with consumers? How do you collect it responsibly? How do you use it responsibly? And we've built the platform to be super flexible so that we can be responsive to what the market wants. And what the market wants right now is responsible data for AI. And we'll talk a little about how we do that. So firstly, and one of the big things for us, big concept, is that AI and privacy really are tied to the hip. And to capture the value and competitive advantage from Gen AI, it's imperative that businesses have privacy-safe solutions. So I wanted to dig in on that concept a little bit with you, Vivek, and Alysa. And to do that, I found these random stats that just perfectly make my point. And the first one is, Gartner had a study where they asked executives, what are the things that are stopping you deploying your AI? And what a lot of executives said across enterprises that they surveyed was, well, we're actually worried about threats from the outside. We're worried about data breaches. We're worried about those kind of penetrations. But actually, security and privacy incidents most of the time came from inside the house. And a perfect example there is Samsung, right? It's the one everybody talks about. The developer there put some code into ChatGPT or sensitive Samsung code. Now everybody can see it. I want to ask you, Vivek, what are some of the things happening in that area to protect business data from hitting AI? And is there some things that just aren't possible, or you can never stop the copy paste of code, right? Or can you?
Well, unconditionally, no, right? You can't stop copy paste. So there always have to be some guardrails, some rules of the road that that everybody who's employed at a company has to follow. You ask like what's happening. It's fascinating, right? Like the ease of the user interface now with ChatGPT and generative AI and LLMs in particular has meant that anybody who can construct prompts, anybody who can write English and describe problems in English, in theory, has become an AI user, right? The bar to access AI, the bar to even use AI has gone significantly lower because of that. Right? Whereas earlier you had to have data scientists using, they had to massage and clean data to train models and then leverage those models. Now I can just go to chat.openai.com, pose a problem, provide some context, and voila, I get my answer, right? So that is the reason why you see all of these statements from these analysts that the risk is from the inside, because employees now are looking at these tools as productivity enhancers, and they're not necessarily paying attention to the implications of, oh, I just put this prompt into this information. Should I have? Could I have? Like these are concerns, right? And then you get to the statement by IDC, which is rightly so now, people are getting paranoid and they're putting all these guardrails. Like you can't access this data, you can't do this. They're putting up firewalls where you can't even access OpenAI from within organizations. So lots is happening, and it's on a wide spectrum. But yeah, the potential and the challenges, the risks, both are very, very real.
Yeah, thanks, Vivek. Actually, and Alysa, thanks for setting up the IDC point there, Vivek. Alysa, I wanted to ask you about that one as well. I was surprised how high this number was. That we all know the machines are hungry and they're fed by data and they're better with data. But almost half of the data that an organization has just can't be used in an AI model because of privacy PII considerations. And I was curious, Alysa, what are those friction points? What are some of those areas or reasons why data can't be used?
Well, I mean, there's legal and there's practical reasons. I think the headline of the IDC probably says it all, really speaks to data provenance, data chain of custody, knowing kind of the origin of where you got that data, under what circumstances, what was it merged with, how does that separate from other data in your systems? And the legal reason there is we have moved into a pretty granular purpose-based permissions. Even if it's opt out, did you have the right representations and promises around how you would be using that data. And I think many companies, because they didn't have to for business generation reasons, really have a data management, personal data management at a sophisticated level. And so we see now just a whole lot of retrofitting data, historical data collected over time, collected and merged from other sources. And I think not as much visibility into what promises were made. And I think for many companies, of course, like you can't anticipate how generative AI was going to take off, and really thinking about, is that important to consumers in terms of how we use that data? How do we talk about that, whether in a privacy policy or in a just-in-time type of setting? And I think companies are concerned about the risk if they use data for these new reasons, these new purposes. What type of exposure does that open up for them? And so I think there's a whole lot of lockdown out of concern on that front.
Actually, we're going to talk later, Alysa, about purpose limitation, how that, what the implications are for that for AI. But Vivek, on this last one, the sheer scale, I mean, we can't underestimate here. I mean, and you know, 40% of organizations might have thousands of AI models deployed, like today. What does that mean from a governance perspective, and what are some of the ways to think about solving for that?
Yeah, and look, we're working in various capacities with customers that have these hundreds and thousands of models deployed. Governance is a huge concern, and it actually starts with a very practical point. Like, how do you keep track of these thousands of models? Do you actually, very pedestrian, do you even actually have a model registry where you can look at, oh, here are all the models. Model A was trained on data sets X, Y, and Z. Here are the properties of data sets X, Y, and Z. Here are the evaluation reports. The model was trained on these data sets, evaluated on these data sets. Here are the reports of those evaluations, the performance metrics, the properties of the underlying data sets. That very pedestrian or ostensibly pedestrian task of keeping track, a system of record really, is where it all starts. That's governance 101. And then you can start to answer, well, okay, are the models fair? Is there bias in my models? Did I collect this data responsibly? All of that lineage or that chain of custody that Alysa was talking about, right? So if you just have one or two models, big whoop. You know, you can just store it on your local file system or somewhere else. And when somebody needs something, they'll email you and you can answer the question. But and people do have thousands of models, you can't keep that even in a spreadsheet, because the amount of information you have to track is just vast. So so governance starts with just a registry, a system of record where you can just track all of these things so that you can confidently answer the kinds of questions that I posed earlier.
Where or with whom does it start, Vivek? Like, is it who, and maybe it's early, but who owns this? Is it privacy people? Is it data people? Is it all of those? Like, what are you seeing?
You know, it's a great question, right? And this came up in another conversation I was having over the weekend. There is ownership and there is sponsorship, right? So when it comes to sponsorship, right, it has to come from the CEO. It has to be an executive level charter that we care about these things. And I, the CEO, I am going to put this on my executive dashboard. Progress, updates, status, whatever it is, right? As far as tactically where this owns, the right owner, the most effective owner for this is the person whose organization is directly responsible for these things going into production. They're the ones who have to serve as the gate. Like, they're the ones who need to be held accountable. You cannot put a model in production unless it is part of a registry and you can confidently share these 3 bits of information about the model. Now, that requires collaboration across a large number of stakeholders. Legal needs to get involved because you have to figure out what you want to report on from a compliance perspective. Data teams need to get involved. because they're the ones who will provide information on what data was used, how it was obtained, et cetera, et cetera. The data scientists need to be involved because they're the ones who are going to present information on how the models were trained, what the metrics are, so on and so forth. And then ultimately, the technology teams are going to get involved because they're the ones who put these things in production. So it becomes a cross-functional kind of effort. But my preference is for this to be owned by ultimately the CTO, because they're the ones responsible for putting these things in production.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Alysa, what are you seeing from your perch?
I mean, that's exactly it. I think we have this knee-jerk reaction to just put more things on the privacy lawyer's plate because they're doing data protection impact assessments. So isn't this just another type of risk assessment? And often, again, just practically, those people are already, pretty neck deep in just trying to set up a basic privacy governance program. And it's not as effective. And I think the point that Vivek made in terms of both sponsorship and ownership and accountability, you do that for business reasons because you want your use of AI to succeed. And for that to work, it really has to be intentional. It's a business plan. It's not a legal plan. The legal plan is going to support and enable, but it's really the business goals there that have to just be attacked head on.
Yeah, thanks, Alysa. So this brings me to this. I love this quote. There's, I think, 10 or 12% of AI projects now in the design phase. Actually, sorry, other way around. 50-60% are in the design phase. Only 10% are actually in production. And so Gartner on one of their webinars talked about why that is, why AI projects never really leave the design phase and quite make it into production. And what they talk about here is it's privacy. It's privacy and security implications, just slowing that down. And Alysa, I wanted to ask you here, what are some of those points that are obstacles, that are gates to getting AI projects live?
I mean, well, one of them is, I think we're used to the privacy lawyers and professionals being that last mile. You go to them to help with the notices. You go to them to, it's already baked or nearly all baked, and you're really focusing on kind of the optics and compliance processes thereon. And I think so much of this is really at the start of it, right? At the start of data collection and thinking how you want to use the data and having it be much more, the life cycle. Again, back to the point Vivek made. I mean, it's just having involvement and input and planning from the beginning to the middle so that you can bake in the privacy and security issue spotting at the outset to give the flexibility to be able to use it for these reasons. And I think they're the points I raised earlier, and a whole lot of privacy policies and privacy notices had pretty clear representations that did not cover all the types of new AI projects that we're really thinking about now. And we've already seen, some media coverage on companies who may not have done it right. And sometimes there's such fear factor, which I know we'll get into, that it's your brand, and a whole lot of negative publicity can really impair the business goals of moving forward and making it be a real success.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Vivek, I wanted to ask you, how is privacy tech rising to meet some of these challenges? But before we do that, I love how you talk about Gen AI just in pure English. So if you could give us a little primer from your perspective on what is it, how do you think about it?
Yeah, look, I mean, the thing that excites me the most about generative AI are the first 2 points on this slide, right? First, I don't think I'm the only person saying it, that everybody's now saying that Gen AI will accelerate business productivity. But exactly how it does that is the interesting thing for me, right? With generative AI, because of the way these large language models work and their potential, the unit cost of production, whatever you're producing, if you're a knowledge worker, right, programmer, content generator, analyst, etc., the unit cost of production of your output has gone down because of generative AI and LLMs. So that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for you as a business. You can now think about whether you want to keep your workforce the same and increase your output, right? Because the unit cost has gone down. Or you can choose, hey, you know what? I'm very happy with the level of output I have right now. So I'm going to repurpose my resources to do other things and invest in other areas of the business. So that aspect or that observation has led to a lot of interesting applications of Gen AI, whether they're in software, right? Software production, so programmers using tools like Copilot, or content producers using tools like Writer, Jasper, or ChatGPT directly, or a whole bunch of creator ad agencies using image generation tools for enhancing creatives or generating creatives and whatnot. Whatever the use case is, that productivity enhancement is happening because of generative AI. The second thing is something I mentioned earlier, that it's just so much more accessible now because of the way in which this is because of the user interface that is provided. It's English, right? You can type a prompt, describe the problem you're trying to solve, and interact with the large language model as if you were interacting with an assistant, right? And that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for you where AI wasn't accessible to you, right? The underlying kind of technology is pretty straightforward, conceptually at least, very complicated to implement, but conceptually, a large language model essentially predicts the next word given the words that it has seen earlier, right? So if you think about a word like a sentence like the cat sat on the, and you ask the large language model to complete it, it will generate many options for that last word. And the way it generates it, you can think of it like it is drawing words from a ginormous probability distribution where each word has a likelihood of completing that sentence. And so the likelihood of spaceship completing that sentence is very low. The likelihood of mat completing that sentence is very high. So when you give that prompt to the large language model, the cat sat on the, it is more likely to return words like mat, table, chair, and less likely to return words like spaceship and pita bread, or whatever it is that you can think of that cats are not likely to sit on, right? So that's at a very high level how a large language model works. Now, because of the ease of use and the simplified user interface, this opens up a lot of risk as well, as we've discussed earlier. Like people can write whatever in that ChatGPT prompt, right? They can disclose sensitive information, like what happened with Samsung. So with this potential, with this immense potential, comes a lot of risk and a recognition of the fact that, oh yeah, we need to be thoughtful about how we put this into practice, and we use generative AI as well.
Yeah, Vivek, a couple of questions. And so to your point earlier about, and so businesses are shutting it down because of the risks, but we should be thinking about paths forward. I wanted to ask you, what are some of those? Privacy tech, are they stepping in? What are some of the things that privacy tech, places where it's innovating to solve some of these? But also, I wanted to ask you, if it's the cat sat on the, and there's a probability distribution, which is kind of the last piece of it, does that explain a little why sometimes you ask the same question, you get a different answer?
Exactly, right? Because and that's why you will see, if you observe carefully, when you put a prompt into ChatGPT, it doesn't give you the full answer at once. You will see that it is, and it's subtle, but it is slowly generating the next word, right? And so that's exactly the reason why because it's a probability distribution, you get different answers. That's why you also have that regenerate response button at the bottom after it's given you a response, because it can give you a different response because it's drawing from a probability distribution as well. So yes, you're absolutely right. To answer your first question, JJ, there are some very interesting technologies that are coming out. Most of them fall in this category of a mediation layer between ChatGPT and the users. And you can think of it like, okay, Whereas earlier, you were sending your prompt directly into ChatGPT. Now you have a mediator that is looking at the prompt you sent and assessing whether there is personal data in it, sensitive data in it, and if so, it applies various techniques like obfuscation, anonymization, tokenization, etc., before that prompt is sent over to ChatGPT. And then on the way back, after it gets its response, it is untokenizing, de-anonymizing, de-obfuscating the response so that you have the response that you actually needed, right? Now, this mediation layer is working for the business. It's not operating on behalf of ChatGPT, but it's a tool deployed by the business. And they have these tools allow businesses to track all this information. Who's sending what prompts? Who's including PII? How often did PII get intercepted and not sent over to ChatGPT? So that's the majority of the applications or tooling that's been developed fall in that category of this mediation layer between ChatGPT and the users.
Perfect. Thank you, Vivek. And over to you, Alysa. So then the other side of this, what are some of the legal considerations? We talked about the friction points, but in friction points to use it, but when you're actually using it, what are some of the legal areas we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I break it down almost like the word problem, right? You've got the risks with your data inputs and the personal information or confidential business information or regulated information or even information you owe via contract to different partners, whether you can use it in this way. So there's that layer of, are you using data even for generative AI in a way that's going to raise some exposure? And then there's the processing itself and then the outputs. And if you don't have the data loss prevention strategies, essentially which is what Vivek was talking about, these intermediary layers, then it's what kind of outputs can really choose your own adventure on your legal exposure, right? What is and have some imagination here too, right? Like, how will that information be used? It could be data leakage in terms of commercial information or personal information that is then used. Maybe the use case is with consumers, and does it involve anything that could create harm, monetary harm, economic harm, physical harm, health concerns? It's really thinking through how would this be used, and that of course is going to trigger different types of legal claims. You've got the layer on just how you are talking about or not talking about your use of a generative AI tool. And so do you run into an advertising or consumer protection unfair and trade practice, which, by the way, in a lot of states can also apply to B2B scenarios. So I think it's really thinking through and taking your use cases as opposed to just in the abstract, but really thinking about your use cases. Is it entirely internal? What kind of data are we using? What are the outputs and the use cases for those outputs? What type of issues are that going to raise from a relationship standpoint, B2B relationship standpoint, from a B2C, from a brand reputation? It's so much of this, and the point Vivek said, I think, was really right on, in that it's not static. And so how do you even assess what those output consequences are? Because it's not kind of your first trial testing, it's going to iterate. And so it's really the oversight and monitoring to make sure that whatever mitigation measures you had at the front end, those continue to be sufficient for the ongoing usage and evolution of your generative AI tools. And I just had, a client reach out to me recently and raised a really good question on, we talk about watermarks and transparency because it's not black letter law, but I think there is a demand to know when generative AI is being used to begin with. And is it deceptive if you are not disclosing that generative AI is being used in some capacity, whether in a B2B context, you're using these tools to make the work more efficient, but does your customer know that? And do they need to approve that before that occurs, right? Are they paying for something that is not what you are delivering when you are making it more efficient by using generative AI? So I think just really thinking through all the different ways this comes into play, including insurance coverage, and whether whether all of those kinds of potential issues are adequately covered.
Thanks, Lisa. We've got
Actually, just one thing to add over there, right? At least I just want to double down on this. The discussion of the use case for generative AI is so important, right? Because on the one hand, you have very simple, I'm going to give ChatGPT a prompt and get back an answer, and I'm going to use that answer to do something. That is the simplest possible use case. Even that, as we've discussed, is fraught with risk and privacy implications and whatnot, right? But now, as you climb up the ladder of use case complexity of generative AI, you end up with at the top of the ladder is you train a large language model, you fine tune it with your proprietary data, right? And the moment you do that, the output now becomes very interesting as well, because now you have this risk of PII coming out in the output. And some people think that, oh, even if if these are just internal use cases, we don't need to worry about it. But think about it, right? Like HR, performance reviews, etc., is being talked about as an application of generative AI. You train an LLM, you fine-tune an LLM with your proprietary human resources data, and suddenly, without the right governance controls, people who might not have otherwise had access to certain bits of data now do, because it's now in a review, right? So these are the considerations that you must think about and talk through with your engineers, your data scientists, your data engineers, your lawyers, as you are thinking about deploying generative AI.
All right. So now, sorry, JJ, but I got to respond to that one, because I think that's absolutely right. And it also goes to one of the questions in the chats on, it's not just your internal use cases for using generative AI, but it's all of the tools that are available, and really thinking about how your HR, is that a use case, a series of tools? What kind of vetting do you do over the tools based on the kind of data that's going to go in, but really what decisions are you going to that are going to spring forth from your use of generative AI? There are, to be clear, there are a lot of B2B generative AI tools being offered and in the market. There are corporate accounts being offered, but you take it as the corporate account with the model as it arrives based on web scrape data and what have you. And that population may not be reflective of the use case in your population, and it will absolutely iterate with your data, your proprietary data. But what does that look like in the beginning versus, and this is where you get into bias or just not really applicable results, because your environment may be totally different from how the model was originally based. So I think that's something to think about. There's a lot of talk about indemnification clauses for some of these B2B tools, and I would just caution, they're pretty limited indemnifications, number one, right? They might cover IP issues, but not others. And it's also like that indemnification stops at the moment you have control over your variables and you are using inputs and outputs that you have control over, and you're going to be responsible for that. And at the end of the day, it's your brand on the line.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Exactly what I was going to ask. It's the question was, if there isn't an agreement between an employee and a corporate account with OpenAI, which there is, how do you prevent? I mean, any transfer of confidential information is an unauthorized disclosure, but it doesn't quite help you if it was private information that is now out there, like we saw in the Samsung example.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So I wanted to get into the study as well. So let's do that. But thank you for the questions. And the question on retention, we're going to hit that over here as well. So a little on the study, we did this in partnership with the Ethical Tech Project. The Ethical Tech Project is a think tank of business and academia, policy and legal minds. And really the idea is, how do you develop the blueprints for the ethical use of data? And there's two parts of it. One is a policy blueprint. Here are the responsible data practices that you should adopt. And to your point, Vivek, something that the CEO could sign on to. And then secondly, how do you make it happen with a technical blueprint, which they call the privacy stack? And what are those pieces, and how do you make that happen when you're talking to the CTO? So a little on the study, 2,500 US adults, really skewing towards consumers, people who are actually buying things, making the purchase decision in the home. And we did that because we wanted to quantify, and will you actually buy more from brands who approach data responsibly and ethically? And it's hot off the presses. We did this in September this year. So the first thing, and this was kind of a general feeling, right, that the jury's kind of out on whether people like AI, whether it's favorable or unfavorable. And the question I had for you here, Vivek, is, all right, so we're kind of split when we asked about artificial intelligence, but then you ask the same question about machine learning, and all of a sudden, people are cool with machine learning in the way that they weren't with AI. And my question is, are they different? Is artificial intelligence just a charged word, or how different are they?
Well, so artificial intelligence is the umbrella, right? Is the containing umbrella, and machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. That's one way to look at it. My theory on why this is so, these two terms are often used interchangeably by people. My kind of cheeky response to when I looked at these numbers was that, well, I don't see any articles in the news saying machine learning is coming for your jobs. Machine learning is going to take over the world. Machine learning is an existential threat. It's always AI is taking over your jobs. AI is an existential threat. AI could be doing this. AI could be doing that, right? So I think that has something to do with it, according to me. But it's also that machine learning is a smaller, is a subset of artificial intelligence. I mean, that's probably why you're seeing this response.
Gotcha. Thanks, Vivek. And then, Alysa, one of the ways we, actually the themes of the study was that it's like a cautious optimism. Like people are concerned, kind of excited, but mostly concerned, but they see the benefit. And in other studies we've done in the past, we've seen this as well. That actually we don't give people or consumers enough credit on how much they understand the value exchange with brands. Like they get it that data is a currency that gets exchanged, and artificial intelligence isn't necessarily changing that for them, but it seems like there's a trust issue here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a trust deficit here.
Yeah.
I think consumers want to know when generative AI, because AI is happening in the background for so many things. And I think that's the point of when it's machine learning to making systems work versus kind of the role of the bots, the role of the generative AI and automated decision-making, and consumers, depending on the context, actually really do want to know that, because that could make things wonderful. It could potentially introduce harm, or in the consumer protection world, we say, is it material enough to affect the purchasing decision or to affect their choice of conduct? And I think if we approach this as a legal disclosure, it's possible consumers won't read that. It's also possible it doesn't really meaningfully convey, and from the business trust standpoint, have we missed an opportunity to really develop a more loyal, durable relationship with the consumer who appreciates that you recognize them and you're having a conversation with them. And by not only talking about your use of it, you get them excited about it, right? That where they can see the benefit and they feel like you've been forthright in talking about how you use it. And I think that that's the challenge for a lot of companies, is moving to that point, making the case for it.
Actually, one comment on this, right? And as a consumer now, speaking as a consumer, that trust point that Alysa made is spot on, right? And I'm sure everyone has seen or read articles or heard stories about, oh, yeah, I was just talking to my friend about Volvos, and suddenly I started seeing ads about Volvos in my newsfeed or whatever, right? Now, and they're like, oh, what are these guys doing? Are they listening to every conversation? Maybe they are. I don't believe that, right? Because the amount of these companies have a massive data infrastructure, but to record and process every bit of thing that everybody says, you need a lot more infrastructure than what you have right now, right? But the point is that these companies are not transparent about how they use the data, which is what leads to these questions and these conspiracy theories and all of this speculation about, well, what's happening with my data, what's not. And then to add to that, there are all these data breaches, and we come up with all these, we find out like, oh, so and such data was shared with such and such organization, and they did so and so with it. Like, this trust is so important. And that's why you're seeing that they do see benefits, but there's a lot of concern too.
Yes, well, thank you, Vivek. And by the way, the Pew Research did a very similar study recently that found very similar results. Alysa, to your point on do they read privacy policies, I think one of the findings of that study is that 60% of people don't, which we kind of knew. They're clicking through, they're saying yes. I don't know if that's contributing to the trust benefit, but they're not quite there on seeing a privacy policy as the answer to this.
And it's not. I mean, I think let's think about what the purpose of a privacy policy is. In a lot of ways, it's accountability. And that started with the FTC. They could more easily enforce under their deception prong, which meant, did you say something that was misleading, or did you not say something that was really important that you should have said? And so the privacy policy is a way to hold you to your promises about your data practices. But I don't think it's something that you really expect consumers for taking the time to go to your privacy policy and read before they decide to engage with you. And if we think about it that way, that's really a legal disclosure, which we have to do. But the trust factor, the relationship factor, it's not about the privacy policy. It's about how do you have a conversation with the consumer in a way that's not friction, but it's really embracing them. And that's much more of a marketing, customer branding point of view, because it's meaningful to have that conversation and build that trust. And that's, lawyers can certainly help with that, but I don't think that starts with the lawyer disclosure.
Such an interesting point. And let's try to your point, Vivek, about building trust. Yeah, these privacy policies actually just kind of realizing it now. They're not written for consumers. They're written for the FTC and the CCPA, and it's not designed for consumers. So how do we bridge that gap? Well, let's keep moving here, because I want to share some of these others. We dug in on specific use cases for AI, and we asked people if they support or oppose them. And what was interesting is, like, I wanted to ask both of you this grouping of use cases where people were so supportive and it's not a problem. Translation, navigation, yeah, all day, we don't care. But then you start to get into this, customer service, investment advice, self-driving cars, and opposition starts to increase. And I was curious why you thought that is. Like, what are these groupings? What's happening here?
Well, from my perspective, like your top boxes, the primary purpose of the tool is pretty apparent. It's intuitive to the consumer, right? It makes it faster. They're getting the benefit right away from using a virtual assistant. They know that they are talking to a machine to help getting those tips. And it's not going to impact whether they can get a house or not. Whereas I think the bottom ones, we do start getting into both automated decision-making, like, are you going to decide whether I'm eligible or not? Are you going to decide whether I can get this operation or not? And what if you made the decision based on a black box of faulty advice, and I don't know how to contest that? Or you self-driving cars, where I'm worried that if the modeling is wrong, I could end up really seriously injured in such a car. So I think it's really the consequences, the potential consequences or fear of it, that get to the point of, I don't trust because I don't understand. And I know that if it's done wrong, it could really negatively affect my life or others people's lives.
So I agree with that. And I think there is something else going on here as well. If you look at the first row, translation, navigation, virtual assistants, translation, navigation, I don't know the answer. When I ask a machine to translate a sentence for me, I don't know the answer. That's why I'm asking the machine. So I'll take and I can't verify the answer. Maybe I can spend extra time to kind of verify it, but because I don't know it myself, before I start the process, I trust it. Same thing with navigation. I want to go from here, from San Francisco to San Jose. Yeah, I know a couple of routes, but I'll trust the machine to tell me what's the fastest route, because I don't know what's going on the freeways right now. With things like customer service, and this is personally as a consumer, the first thing I do when I call some customer service, I press 0. I want to talk to a human being, right? Because we think that machines will not understand us as effectively as humans will. Self-driving cars is another great example, right? We hold machines to a much higher standard. I'll give you an example, right? A few weeks ago, there was a bad accident in San Francisco where a human being driving a car, there was hit and run. This person crashed into a pedestrian, and a pedestrian went flat on the ground, and this person just drove off, right? There was a cruise car coming behind this person, and this behind this car, and because the person who had been hit, they were flat on the floor. This the cruise car couldn't figure out this was a human being, so they went over slowly, but they went over the human being, and that created a whole bunch of brouhaha about, well, self-driving cars are not trusted, blah blah blah. But the human being who was driving actually sped off. Nobody's talking about that, right? So the machines are also held to a much higher standard, which is why you see this this difference in responses with support or opposition across the different types of use cases, according to me.
Yeah, Vivek, it's a really interesting question. We probably don't have time to answer it today, but like, should they be held to the standard? And I don't know the answer to that. So let's dig in, because I want to get into the responsible data practices, and we might just have a minute or two on each of those. You know, we asked, if you had a magic wand, would you go back to a time when companies didn't understand so much about us? And of course, you know, 3/4 of the population said yes. And I think this just represents the angst that we've been talking about here, that consumers are feeling, and the lack of trust, because we know they understand the value exchange. The result of that, I think, is, yeah, we want control over how our data gets used. Yes, we want choices, and some of these are reflected in privacy laws today, but not quite all the way there. But let's dig into each of the responsible data practices, and I have a question for each of you on those. So we asked specifically about, you know, purpose limitation. We didn't quite frame it that way, but we'll talk about how we asked about it. These are the data practices we ask consumers about in the context of AI. But there's one missing, and the one that's missing is data minimization. And what I wanted to ask both of you is, you know, these OECD principles, and a lot of these principles that you know, for example, GDPR and other privacy laws are built on, data minimization is one of them. But AI seems like a data maximization strategy. So what do you do about that? Do we need to rethink these principles in the context of AI, or do these principles that we thought of for privacy still kind of work?
Well, I think that there is a balance that you can strike, right? And there is definitely benefit in using data to provide value to the consumer and drive value for the business. I don't think there is any question about that. Numerous studies have kind of shown that, right? Now, where I kind of draw the line is, yes, you can collect as much data as you want, as long as you are transparent and you provide the choice to the consumer as to, so that they can control what, not only what you can collect, but how you process it, right? And giving the consumer the choice is not enough. You actually have to re-architect or design your data processing systems so that they can respect those consumer choices too. So, you know, minimization, maximization, I think there are two ends of a spectrum. As with most things in life, right? I try to find the middle point where how can I leverage value? How can I generate value from this? What do I need to do to build trust with consumers so that I can collect as much data as consumers will allow me to, and use as much data as they will allow me to, because I want to provide value back to them. That's how I think about it anyway.
Yeah, well, and actually, Alysa, this gets us to the point you made earlier about you collected data probably with a very narrow purpose, and now maybe we're trying to broaden it. Consumers for all of these, it was off the charts. They want this, right? And of course, we didn't ask purpose limitation, but they just said we want purpose limitation. They said, hey, it's collected for a specific purpose. What do you do with that? And there was a question in the Q&A about retention. So, question for you first, Alysa, like this totally makes sense to you, right? That consumers would want this and they're sensitive to this. How do we think about that?
It makes sense. And it's also the data minimization principle, because it's not that you can't keep any kind of data for a long time for really legitimate business purposes. I think the question is, do you really need to keep sensitive personal information or personal information in a personal form, right? Consistently, that gets used in all different ways. And I think what we're seeing is, because there is demand for it, because there's risk associated with personal information and different types of personal information, a whole lot more innovation on actually effective privacy enhancing technologies and de-identified data that truly can still solve the business purpose. And I think that's where there has been, people have seen those opportunities and have really invested in it. And there is a slow uptick, right? We know of a lot of what we would call PETs, privacy enhancing technologies that are available on the market that are not necessarily being used at scale yet. But I think that is a window that many are exploring so that they can both do all the business objectives with the power of data, but within the confines of knowing there are restrictions based on the data that they collected. And when they do need personal information to be able to do those business objectives, do you have the right safeguards? And it's not just data security safeguards, right? We talked about model governance and a model registry. That's what we mean, right? Like that if you were going to use it, we're still back to trust. We're still back to what you promised. Do you have a program to work with that data in a way that is consistent with the permissions that you originally sought? Or do you go back? Do you create a user experience, a user preference, so that there is more transparency on that in a way that is important and meaningful to the consumer, so you maintain that trust?
And Alysa, on retention, and this is a legal question and a technical question. So you get a data subject request, and of course you got to pull the data out of the model, right? I mean, is that?
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that, because I put a response in the I think the jury is out on that in a few different ways. This goes back to, like, in your use case, are you doing the reasonable types of safeguards you should? And that goes back to, do you need personal information put into the model? Do you need it as an output of the model? Do you have filter tools associated with that? Is the model itself personal information? We have seen articles out that even if you don't have personal information inputted, your model can predict its potential PI as an output. So that's a foreseeable risk. So how do you manage that as a data loss prevention strategy? And that is on you as the business to foresee that and have something to account for that. But I think if you manage the inputs and outputs, then it may solve and make the issue of, do I need to do the right of erasure back to the model? I think you've solved it in a more scalable way than on a every single type of data subject request type of way. And so I think that's, again, it's like, what are the practical solutions that support the business and also support the privacy obligations here?
Yeah, and Alysa, you mentioned pets, right? Pets are a subset of pets can be applied as transformations to the input, so that when you're training the model, the PII or sensitive data is anonymized, obfuscated, tokenized, what have you, so that the model doesn't see any PII. And some organizations are doing that right now. So I agree with you. I think the practical solution is to address the inputs and outputs, and because the moment you say, well, can you delete it from the model, right? You're not asking my favorite question, is what's the problem you're trying to solve? You're trying to solve PII from going into the model, and so there are other ways of solving that problem as well. Gotcha.
Thanks, Vivek. Choice and control, of course, off the charts, kind of like we said. Vivek, I wanted to ask you here, how are companies approaching the control question? Because Alysa, one of the things I love when you say controls over contracts, or that you need to do both. And so this isn't a contractual thing. You don't solve it through a contract. You have to solve it through technical controls. Vivek, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the obstacles and one of the challenges that we need to overcome when pushing consent downstream?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, right, is that the data systems that we are dealing with have been designed at a time when consent wasn't even thought about, right? So now you have to go in and re-architect those data systems, whether they are stored procedures in SQL databases, or they are MapReduce jobs or Spark jobs, or whatever technology you use to process data. You now have to go modify those jobs and that code to take consent into account. That is the biggest challenge, right? The other thing also is that a lot of people don't do it, or they're like, yeah, we can get away with it, because enforcing it is hard as well. So for an outside third party, regulators, whatever you want to call them, to come in, even consumers, to actually verify that your consent is being respected, that your data is only being used in the way you said it was going to be used, that is hard too. So on both sides, you have challenges. But look, if you are designing something from the ground up right now, make consent, or if you're an engineer, make consent a first-class citizen in your data architecture. If you are a lawyer, a privacy professional working with data engineers, ask them, how is consent incorporated? How can I verify that you are actually respecting users' consent? Have that dialogue with your counterparts to actually design a privacy by design, trust by design system right from the ground up.
Love it. Thank you, Vivek. I'm gonna cut to the dessert here. So people, of course, they want plain communication. They want transparency. We've talked about that a lot. Of course, they want to prevent bias. Actually, I was surprised that this was a little lower than the others. Maybe it reflects what we talked about at IAPP PSR, Vivek, that it's not necessarily the machine's problem here, although there is we're trying to stop the acceleration of bias through their use. Standard practices, of course, they want a uniform way to think about this so businesses can be accountable. But let's talk about, if you did all these things, what would happen? And what would happen is we measured brand trust and purchase intent across companies that were doing it, companies that weren't, 900 scenarios. And the result was a 15% increase in purchase intent. So consumers told us, we will spend more with companies who do AI right. We'll spend more with them, we'll trust those companies more if they do kind of all of those 5 things. So this is a nice data. I remember showing this one to a room full of lawyers, and they all started taking photos, and I was wondering why. And they said, well, because I need to get budget. And thinking about privacy as a compliance thing only doesn't get you budget. But tying it to data monetization, tying it to revenue, absolutely does. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask each of you, just as a closing comment, where do we go from here? Like, what are the things we should do next? What's your advice, basically, for everybody?
I mean, I think, oh, you go first.
Go ahead.
I think you need to bring all the right folks to the table, team sport. And I know it sounds a little hokey, but where you can talk about the revenue lifts that and how we know that, and really piece together that arc with, if you do it right and you address these legal or compliance reasons, it's such a big revenue payoff. And I think often lawyers were not comfortable talking about that angle. We talk about compliance, and I think that has to shift a bit as we work together to like solve these problems.
Yeah, I have three bits of advice, right? One is think offense and not just defense. This goes directly back to your previous slide, which is, don't think of it as compliance, think of it as opportunity to elevate your business. That's thing one. The second thing is, as Alysa said, it's a team sport. Have that dialogue. Go have a beer with each other, right? Like just talk about it. And this goes to my third thing, which is, don't focus on specific solutions. Like we were discussing, how can I delete my data from a model? Think about the problems you want to solve for the end consumer. Put yourself in the consumer's shoes at interacting with your business. How would you want to be treated? Ask yourself those questions, and then design a data system, a data architecture, a privacy program that builds trust with your stakeholders and your consumers.
Awesome advice. Thanks, Vivek, and thanks, Lisa. I appreciate you both. To answer some of the questions in the Q&A here, yes, these slides will be available. If you want the actual study, you can download it here. If you need more information on what Ketch is doing in the space, you can download it here. Selena, any closing comments here? Thank you both, Vivek and Alysa, for this. Super appreciate it.
So that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you, Jonathan, Alysa, Vivek, for sharing these really valuable insights with all of us. We also want to give a big thank you to Ketch for sponsoring today's web conference so that it is free to our audience. Lastly, I do want to encourage you to click the survey link that I put in the chat. Briefly give us your feedback on today's program, so that will help us improve our future web conferences. So we certainly appreciate that. That wraps up today's web conference with Ketch today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you in another IAPP web conference soon.
Thank you.